Hey folks, today I'd like to take a few minutes and talk about that ongoing process for the selection of the Republican presidential candidate and their public debates, which continue to be both amusing and revealing. So I didn't watch the whole debate last week, but I did catch the highlights in which, in particular, Vivek Ramaswamy came on really strong and basically, condemned the entire Republican Party as a party of losers, contrary to Donald Trump's, famous saying, "You'll become so tired of winning." Ramaswamy says, "We're tired of losing." And he went on to, castigate the RNC chair, Ronna McDaniels, basically saying she should step down and let somebody more capable, run this process. Also had some fine words for Nikki Haley, calling her Liz Cheney in 3-inch heels, and, taking the unprovoked opportunity to, criticize Haley's daughter for the use of TikTok. Anyway, Ramaswamy has got quite a mouth on him, and although, Republicans have got used to uh, 4 years of Trump in his mouth, uh, this is a whole different candidate. So I was piqued by his, his performance, in which, he across the board has some pretty controversial ideas. And I wanted to see, is there an astrological rationale for that? Well, yes, I believe there is. Let's have a look at that. Okay, so here is the horoscope for Vivek Ramaswamy. He was born 9th of August, 1985, 6:51 p.m. Cincinnati, Ohio. Renders, a Sagittarius ascendant. His ruler, Jupiter, is mixed condition, being both debilitated and retrograde in the second house. But notice Mercury is directly opposite here. So Jupiter is a lord of two kendras. Mercury is therefore lord of the other two kendras. Those two alone generate a couple of dharma-karma adipati yogas. And then their candidature for creating other yogas with trinal lords is optimized. And the other trinal lords are Mars, Lord of the fifth, and Sun, Lord of the ninth. As a consequence of that, given that Mercury and Jupiter are in mutual aspect, and both Sun and Mars are associated with Mercury on that Mercury-Jupiter axis, bingo, you've got a whole bunch of Dharma-karma adipati yogas going on there. So this is very robust in terms of yogas. Additionally, there's, let's see, I did a count, 2, 4, 6, 8. There are actually 10 Dharma-karma adipati yogas bundled up in this set of two Kendra lords and two Trikonal lords and the various combinations then that they can create. Keeping in mind, of course, that Jupiter functions as a dual lord of both Kendra and Trikona as lord of the ascendant. There's a Dana Yoga there with Mars and Saturn in mutual aspect by virtue of their special aspects. And there's a few other things going on. So, I mean, it's a real powerhouse in some respects. And it does have some of the signatures for government service. Typically we're looking for Lord of the fifth for management of large projects, or what we would call ministry, portfolio management. Lord of the ninth for the legislative aspect of government, and Lord of the 10th for governance and administration. So respectively, we're talking about Mars, Lord of the 5th, Sun, Lord of the 9th, and Mercury, Lord of the 10th. They are all in Sambandha. Actually, all three of them are together in the 8th house. I mean, that is a little bit of a spoiler, but it's more the fact that Mars is debilitated that creates the spoilage in this example. And therein lies one of the critical aspects of this. For significant government service, we're typically looking for some, some banda, strong bond between fifth and 10th Lord. And, there are other combinations, but that one is, fairly critical. That is soiled or spoiled or damaged, contaminated by the very condition of Mars, which is debilitated, is moderately combust. We might say mildly combust, but it's a judgment call. And of course, this whole cluster placed in the eighth house, which might suggest that, any such governmental responsibilities might, go off the rails. Indeed, listening to Ramaswamy, you sort of get an idea of a guy who, assumes the podium has got a bit of a tendency to go off script, if indeed he has one. Now, the guy is basically a self-made billionaire. Credit to that. He's well-educated, born of an immigrant family who made a success of themselves. But what he has done for himself is quite remarkable. And he's kind of a poster child for immigrants. What he has done, he's almost lived up to this, saying that in America anything is possible. So he's wonderful in that respects, but for government service, it's a bit debatable, and he has a tendency to say some awfully rash things. Partly as aspect of his cultural upbringing, he's like radically anti-woke, and some people will like that, and some people won't. But he's got some other pretty radical ideas about, whether Ukraine should be supported in the face of, Russian aggression. And there he's going to part ways with a lot of other people who are sympathetic to Ukrainian cause. Anyway, never mind all that. Let's get to the astrology. For me, with all these dharma-karma adipati yogas that are formed courtesy of Mercury and Jupiter, Sun and Mars, among those four grahas, two of them are debilitated. So Mars is debilitated in Cancer, Jupiter is debilitated in Capricorn. Right away, we've got to entertain the prospect of, does Neechabhanga exist for either or both of these two grahas, and will such a condition save these otherwise significant yogas from, self-destruction of some form? Well, let's see. So I'm going to make pretty short shrift of this, and excuse me if I go fairly quickly for the interests of time. But basically, when we're looking at a debilitated graha, first and foremost, we're going to look at it itself. Does it occupy a kendra from the lagna or the moon? The answer here in both cases is no and no. Then, vis-a-vis its dispositor, the moon. Does that moon aspect that graha? No, moon does not aspect Mars. Does that moon occupy a kendra from the lagna or from the moon? Well, it does not from the lagna, and it can't be counted because the moon is always angular to itself, so that doesn't count. Then we move on to the planet that would be exalted in that sign. So Mars is debilitated in Cancer. What would be exalted there? Jupiter. Is Jupiter in a kendra from lagna or the moon? No and no. Does Jupiter aspect that Mars? Yes. Move on then to the planet that would be the planet ruling the sign in which Mars, debilitated Mars, would be exalted. Well, Mars would be exalted in Capricorn, so we're talking about Saturn. The question is Saturn in a kendra from lagna or moon? No and no. Does Saturn aspect the debilitated planet Mars? Yes, it does. So if you're counting on your fingers, there were 12 points of contention, one of which I had to discard because moon, dispositor of Mars, cannot be kendra to itself. It is by definition. So we're left with 11 points of consideration. Among those 11 points, only 2 scored a hit. That's where Jupiter aspects Mars and Saturn aspects Mars. Jupiter is Lord of Cancer, where Mars is debilitated, and Saturn, Lord of Capricorn, where Mars would be exalted. And last thing but not least, we have to look at Mars dispositor and Saturn, the place where Mars would be exalted. Are they in kindred to each other? No. The sum of all those is 12 points, one of which we have to discard. So that leaves 11 points of consideration, of which we only got 2 yeses and the rest were nos. 2 yeses out of 11 possibilities is only an 18% score. That's definitely a failing grade on Neechabhanga for Mars. So this Mars remains Neecha, debilitated, and not ameliorated or improved by the effects or assistance from Mars dispositor or Jupiter, which would be exalted in Cancer, or Saturn, which rules the sign where Mars would be exalted. So Mars is kind of kaput. It's too damaged, and it cannot be raised up by any sort of prosthetic assistance from other planets in the horoscope. Then now let's look at Jupiter, which is the other debilitated graha. And we go through the very same protocol. First and foremost, we ask ourselves, is Jupiter in a Kendra from Lagna or the Moon? No and no. Vis-a-vis Jupiter's dispositor, Saturn, is it in a Kendra from the Lagna or the Moon? No and no. Does that Saturn aspect Jupiter? No. Then we move on to the sign where that Jupiter would be exalted, that is Cancer, and is the Moon in a Kendra from the Lagna or the Moon? And the answer to one is no, and the other answer is we cannot consider the Moon as Kendra to itself, of course, because it is. So we have to discard that particular point and move on. Then does that Moon, Lord of Jupiter's exaltation sign, aspect that Jupiter? No, it does not. Then finally, what's left to be done in all this, planet ruling the sign where Jupiter would be exalted, we've done that. I've missed something. Planet that would be exalted in that debilitated sign. Okay, Jupiter is debilitated in Capricorn. What about Mars, which would be exalted in that sign? Is it a Kendra from the Lagna or the Moon? No and no. Does that Mars aspect that Jupiter? Yes, it does. So again, we ended up with a similar kind of situation where we're starting out of 12 possible points of contention. We had to discard one. We ended up with 11. But of all that, we ended up with only Mars aspect upon Jupiter providing some assistance. That's only 1 out of 11 points gets a nod. That's only a 9% score out of the possibilities. So that means Jupiter as well is Neecha, and it's irrevocable. It does not enjoy Neechabhanga. The planet itself doesn't enjoy Neechabhanga. Therefore, there's no Neechabhanga yoga and there's no Neechabhanga Raja yoga. Because if the planet itself does not clear the hurdle to be exempted from debilitation status, if it's irrevocable, then it cannot carry the weight of the yogas in which it participates. So what's interesting now is to look at this Mars and Jupiter, both of which are debilitated. And what's interesting to note is that they each attempted to come to each other's assistance. The only factor in favor of Jupiter's rehabilitation was Mars' aspect upon it. With Mars, it's only saving graces were Jupiter's aspect upon it and Saturn's aspect upon it. Well, in both those cases, Mars is trying to be rescued by a debilitated Jupiter. Meanwhile, a debilitated Jupiter, it's trying to gain assistance from a debilitated Mars. It's like having a crutch that's broken and using another crutch to tie a splint onto that crutch is just not going to work. So it's weak for both of them, and that damages all of these yogas in which they participate to some degree. Uh, how does this bear upon Ramaswamy's candidature? Well, because Mars in particular is a party to the potential governmental signatures of Lord of 5 and 9 and 10, respectively Mars, Sun, and Mercury, in this bundle in the eighth house. Because Mars is irrevocably damaged, not to mention being in the eighth house, this is a poor prospect. And I believe it won't be too long before he concedes, that he's not gaining traction here. Um, Now, mind you, he's got deep pockets. He's funding himself, aside from, fundraising that he's doing from supporters. So, he may have long legs in this respect, but ultimately, I believe it's the things that he says that are going to damn him to some degree. So, back to Mars and Jupiter, this axis of evil, I'm going to call it, the two debilitated grahas that cannot be rescued by themselves nor other planets, grahas in the horoscope, running on the second and eighth house axis. It inevitably affects the second house, which, among other things, is the mouth, what goes in and out of the mouth. So, although we use it as an indicator for diet and family and wealth and education and any other number of things, it is also indicative of what we say. And so, whether those be truths or falsehoods, or whether those be, outspoken comments, or insults or foul mouth or anything else, the influence of malefics upon the second house is going to be contributory to some problems. If you look at the second house, it is occupied by Jupiter, which is, admittedly a mixed condition graha, debilitated, but it's got brightness in its favor in its retrograde phase. So it's got some mixed strength there. But it's got the aspect of two malefics, Mars and Sun, one of whom is itself debilitated. What about its Lord? Its Lord Saturn is strong and well placed. Saturn is exalted in the 11th house, but it is on the Rahu Ketu axis, which, fouls it to some degree. And it's also aspected by a debilitated Mars. So the Lord, does not do very well here either. Despite its strength, it's under affliction. We would call it destabilized. So all things considered, this is somewhat of a troubled second house in that regard for speech and the things that he has said. And certainly some of these things in his latest debate are going to cause some consternation about his behavior and his potential, tendency to say things that are perhaps off script or ill considered. And eventually, I think it will damn him as a candidate. Okay, be that as it may, we're going to have to wait and see. But I think it's the evidence of two unremediated, debilitated grahas in his horoscope that do not pass, indeed, fail the test of Neechabhanga, therefore will cause, some degree of off the rails phenomenon vis-a-vis his candidature for the presidential nomination. Okay, so time for a little bit of a wrap up. I realize that analysis of Neechabhanga was a bit rushed, and for those who are not familiar at all with the protocol, would probably benefit from something a little slower and perhaps with a table in place to keep score of the planets that are, part of the requisite analysis and, the outcome in each of these sort of litmus tests that I applied to those. This gives me thought that I should probably do a post on the protocol for Neechabhanga on some separate date with a little more pace to it rather than the hurried way in which I did it today. Be that as it may, here we are now with the presidential candidate race getting smaller as the time goes by. Tim Scott has recently dropped out. So now we're down to four: DeSantis, Haley, Christie, and Ramaswamy. I've already commented about Christie in a previous post some time ago. I have not tackled Nikki Haley or Ron DeSantis for the very simple reason that their birth times are not available. So I'm, somewhat stymied in that regard, and that's why I jumped on Ramaswamy because his birth data was available. So going forward, I'm not sure what I'm going to do with Haley and DeSantis. I may have to use Chandra Lugna charts to compare their prospects. But as they say, the race is getting interesting as time goes by. Stay tuned. See you another time.